In a small village hidden among serene mountains, there lived a man named George. He wasn't an ordinary man, but someone who carried with him the wisdom acquired through years of observing the ancestral practices of Buddhism. George was known as a master of rituals and the energy that nature offers to all human beings. One day, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with a soft orange hue, George was visited by an old friend, Edward, an intellectual who had recently distanced himself from traditions to focus on modern life, filled with commitments and responsibilities. Edward seemed tired. His eyes carried a sense of weariness, as if the pressures of urban life had drained his vital energy. George welcomed him into the tea tent he had built, a peaceful space with silk carpets and a window open to the landscape, where the gentle breeze caressed the curtains. The trees around seemed to dance to the rhythm of the wind, and the distant sound of the river brought a sense of calm. "Edward, it's good to see you back to nature," said George, serving hot herbal tea. "You've brought more than just your presence, haven't you? I see in your eyes the search for something you've lost." Edward sat slowly, staring at the tea in his cup with a serious expression. "Yes, George, you're right. I came because I feel like my energy is drained, as if I'm drowning in my own responsibilities. I've read about the benefits of rituals, of purification baths, and thought maybe you could teach me more about that." George calmly looked at his friend, and as if time had slowed down, he began to explain. "There are ways to purify the body and mind, Edward. Water, for example, is a powerful element. It represents fluidity, transformation, and renewal. All our bodies have an energy that connects with nature, and water can be used to cleanse this energy, both internally and externally." Edward frowned, intrigued but still somewhat skeptical. "What do you mean? Can a simple bath have that much power?" George smiled, knowing that more than words would be needed to convince his friend. "Yes, a simple bath. But it's not just any bath. It's a ritual, Edward. It's not just the water that matters, but the intention with which we use it. Every movement, every sensation, every thought must be aligned with the purity and purpose of the ritual. If you want to purify yourself, you must surrender to the experience." Edward looked at the tea and reflected. "I've always heard about the power of water, but never really understood what it meant. How can I apply this to my life?" "Let me tell you a story," replied George, his eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. "A long time ago, a Buddhist monk named Kenzo, who was also lost in his own thoughts and pressures, was advised to bathe in a sacred spring in the mountains. He believed water was just water, but when he entered the cold spring water, something extraordinary happened. He felt the energy of the water penetrating his body, cleansing his mind, and restoring his spirit. Kenzo then understood that water, when used with respect and purpose, is capable of transforming the human being from the inside out." Edward listened attentively, touched by Kenzo's story. "What happened to him after that?" George paused, his voice deep and contemplative. "He became one of the most respected masters of his time. He learned that water not only cleanses the body, but also cleanses emotions and the mind, restoring the lost balance." Edward felt a weight on his chest begin to lighten. He was starting to understand. "So, what do I need to do, George? How can I start?" George leaned slightly forward and looked into his friend's eye. "First, Edward, you need to allow yourself. You have to open your heart to what is coming. It's not enough to just enter the water. You need to let it envelop you. The water will help you release your worries and the pressure you carry." At that moment, the wind passing through the trees increased in intensity, creating a perfect harmony with George's words. The sound of nature seemed to approve what was being said. "I suggest you start with what we call an energy bath. Find a peaceful spot with a clean water source. Dip your hands in the water, and as you do, close your eyes and focus on the sensations of the water flowing between your fingers. As you do this, imagine that each drop of water is washing away your worries, stress, and all negative energies." Edward looked at George with wide eyes, already beginning to feel the energy of the conversation. "And how will I know if I'm doing this right?" George smiled again. "You will know, Edward. The important thing is to trust the process. Let yourself be guided by the water and your senses. Purification is a unique experience for each person. Now tell me, have you ever experienced any form of energetic purification? What rituals or practices have you tried to relieve stress? Leave your opinion in the comments, and let's share these experiences. As the two continued discussing the benefits of the purification bath, the conversation took a deeper turn, with George explaining how the energy of water could be used at different moments in life. Water, not only cleansed, but also nourished. It could help restore the balance between body and mind, allowing the energies of the universe to flow freely through us. George continued, his voice serene and firm. The secret lies in understanding that everything around us is interconnected. The body, the mind, and the soul are parts of a whole. If one becomes unbalanced, it can affect the others. Water has the power to restore that balance. Edward, though more relaxed, still had some doubts. But what about the days when I feel overwhelmed, drained of strength? How can I use water to help me overcome those difficult moments? George smiled, as if he had been expecting this question. In moments of weakness, water can become a true ally. Instead of fighting against what's happening in your life, you must learn to surrender. When you feel lost, take a warm bath with essential oils or herbs that bring a sense of peace. As the warmth envelops your body, visualize the tension melting away, as if the water is melting your pain and worry. George and Edward spent hours discussing how water could be used not just to cleanse the body, but also as a means of spiritual healing. Edward's understanding was expanding, and he began to realize that behind every simple act, like taking a bath, there was a deep and transformative power. The next morning, Edward followed George's guidance and went to the sacred spring in the village. He dipped his hands into the cold water, feeling the energy of the water entering his body, cleansing his tension, fears, and worries. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and for a moment, felt as if he were being purified, as if his soul were being renewed. Edward emerged from the water with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that the journey of self-discovery and purification had just begun, and that water, more than a physical element, would be his companion in the next stages of this journey. Edward couldn't stop thinking about the experience he had the next morning. The cold water from the sacred spring seemed to have removed more than just physical tension. He felt his mind clearer, and the weight of his worries lighter. It was as if something invisible had been removed, though he wasn't sure exactly what. That afternoon, Edward met again with George in the tea tent, where, between sips of hot tea, the conversation continued to deepen. George, with his unwavering calm, watched Edward's gaze, now more attentive, more focused. "I see the water worked its magic, Edward. How do you feel?" Edward smiled, but his expression was serious. "I never imagined something so simple could have so much power. I felt my mind clearer, as if something had been removed. But still, I wonder, how can this last? The world out there won't stop pressuring me, no matter how much I purify myself." George leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing, as if he saw more than the surface of Edward's words. "That's an excellent question. Purification isn't an isolated event, Edward. Just as water is not just water, the ritual is not just a momentary act. It is an ongoing process, a path." Edward seemed to absorb each word with renewed attention. "You mean purification is something that must be practiced always?" "Yes," George answered, pausing. "Modern life forces us to disconnect from our true essence. Work, worries, expectations. All of this takes us further from who we truly are. Purification through water is one way of reconnecting, but there is also another aspect of life that needs purification: the mental body." Edward looked perplexed. "The mental body?" "Yes, your mind, your thoughts, your emotions. Everything you carry in your mind also affects your body. Sometimes, mental tension is deeper than physical tension. Therefore, the ritual is not just about cleansing the body with water, but also about freeing the mind from the emotional burdens we carry," George explained. Edward knew that George was speaking of something deeper. He had already experienced the momentary relief of physical purification, but the mental pressure, that constant feeling of being pulled in multiple directions, was still there. "But how can I purify my mind, George? If the body can be purified in the water, what is needed for the mind?" Edward asked, now with a tone of more urgent curiosity. George smiled, as if he had been waiting for this question for a long time. "The mind, Edward, needs more than just a physical bath. The mind needs silence, introspection. It needs moments of total presence, where you disconnect from all external distractions. This can be done through meditation, for example, or practices of mindfulness." "Meditation," Edward repeated, as if it were a new word. "I was never good at that. I always feel uncomfortable with silence." George, seeing Edward's discomfort, got up and approached a small altar inside the tent. He lit an incense, and the gentle aroma filled the air. Meditation doesn't have to be difficult, nor something you force. It can be simple. Just find a quiet place, sit comfortably, and simply observe your thoughts. Don't judge them, don't control them. Just watch them pass by, like clouds in the sky. Edward took a deep breath, trying to visualize what George was describing. And will this help me release my mind? Yes, but remember, George continued with a wise look, it's not about pushing away thoughts. If you try to do that, they'll only intensify. The secret is to observe, let go, and not cling. By doing this, your mind starts to calm naturally. Edward paused, reflecting on George's words. So, the power of meditation is not to resist thoughts, but to allow them to come and go? Exactly. The mind is like a river. If you try to hold the water back, it builds up, creates a dam, and becomes murky. But if you let the water flow freely, it follows its course, always clean and renewed. Edward felt something inside him ignite, like a flame being fed by these words. He knew the path would be challenging, but he also knew he was starting to understand a bit more about what George was teaching. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he felt he was on the right path. And you? Have you practiced meditation or any other form of mental purification? How do you deal with the pressures and tensions of everyday life? Leave your comment and share your experiences with us. The day passed, and once again, Edward found himself on a new journey, now in search of mental peace. He returned home, reflecting on what he had learned. But the path would not be easy. He knew that internal challenges could be as powerful as external difficulties. However, by starting the practice of meditation, he felt a new type of strength beginning to arise within him. In the following days, he applied what George had taught him. He always found a moment in the day to stop, close his eyes, and simply observe his mind, without rush, without expectation. And little by little, the thoughts began to calm. He realized that when he didn't cling to every thought that arose, his mind became more peaceful, and the peace he had felt in the water of the spring began to invade his being again. One day, while meditating in his garden, Edward had a vision. He saw the water again, this time flowing gently from a distant mountain. The water represented the flow of life, and he knew he had to learn to let himself be carried by that flow, rather than fighting against it. Meditation was becoming a regular practice, and more he felt in tune with his true essence. He now understood that the body, mind, and soul were parts of a whole, and that one could not function without the other. The purification of the mind, just like the purification of the body, was a continuous process, an endless journey, but one that led to a destination of greater peace and balance. George, in his wisdom, knew that Edward was only beginning, but he also knew that the journey of self-discovery and purification is one of the most powerful paths a human being can walk. He also knew that, like the water, this path would continue to flow, without haste, without pressure, only with the tranquility that comes from living in harmony with the universe. In the days that followed, Edward began to notice something he had never noticed before: how much the world around him was filled with noise. Mental, emotional, and physical noise. The pressure of work, family demands, the constant thoughts about the future. All of this was constantly buzzing in his head. But for the first time, he began to realize that silence was not just the absence of sound, but a true tool for transformation. Meditation, although still challenging, began to have a deeper effect. When he closed his eyes and surrendered to the present moment, he felt a peace that seemed always to have been there, waiting to be discovered, but which, until then, he hadn't been able to access. One afternoon, while practicing in the small room he had set up for his meditation practice, Edward began to understand more about silence. The absence of thoughts was not something to be forced, but something that arose when he simply allowed himself to be. He didn't need to control the mind. He just needed to let the thoughts pass by like clouds drifting across the sky. What mattered was his connection with the now, with the present moment. Silence is not just the absence of sound, George said during one of his visits. True silence is the absence of interference. When you allow yourself to simply be, without judgment, without rushing, the mind finds a space of peace. Edward reflected deeply on this. He had never looked at silence in this way. To him, it always seemed like silence was a struggle, a battle against his own thoughts. But now, he was beginning to see that silence was the natural state of the mind, and all he needed to do was let the thoughts pass without clinging to them. So, silence is not a fight against my thoughts, but an acceptance of them. Edward asked, trying to understand more clearly. Exactly, George replied. Thoughts arise, like waves on the sea. You cannot control the sea, but you can choose how to navigate it. The secret is learning to observe, without being carried away by the current. When you realize that thoughts are just thoughts, nothing more than that, you create space for peace. Edward felt a lightness in his words, as if a layer of confusion he hadn't even known existed had been removed. He was beginning to understand that true peace didn't come from achieving a perfect state of silence, but from accepting the fleeting nature of the mind and learning to flow with it. Over the following weeks, Edward incorporated silence into his routine. He made it a sacred space where nothing else mattered except the simple act of breathing and being present. With each practice, he felt more balanced, more centered. At work, in family meetings, even in everyday interactions, he felt calmer, more focused, less reactive. George, noticing the change in Edward, smiled with a satisfied look. He knew that the transformation process was underway, but he also knew that true wisdom would come with time and continued practice. He approached Edward, now calmer, more centered, and asked a question that took Edward by surprise. Edward, have you thought about your life outside of this quest for perfection and control? Edward remained silent for a moment, reflecting on the question. He had never allowed himself to think deeply about this. He had always been in search of results, of solving problems, of controlling his life, his destiny. But something inside him now wondered, what if life wasn't about control? What if it was about acceptance and flow? I've always thought it was about having everything under control, Edward replied finally. I always thought that the key to peace was achieving some kind of perfection. But now, I don't know. Maybe control isn't the way. George looked at him with a soft but deep smile. Exactly. Control is an illusion, Edward. When you try to control everything, you lose the freedom to simply live. True freedom comes when you surrender to the uncertainty of life, to flow with what is, without the need to have everything figured out. Those words touched Edward's heart deeply. He had never thought of me sea of solar, fire, for my throne, sea. The idea of living without the constant pressure to control everything felt liberating, but at the same time, scary. How could he live like that, without the need to have all the answers, without trying to force the outcomes? George noticed the doubt in Edward's eyes and reassured him. I'm not saying you should stop acting or seeking what you desire, but instead of clinging to the idea that you must control everything, try to trust more in the process. And above all, remember that inner silence is the key. When you are at peace within, the rest will be easier to handle. Edward reflected deeply on this. Peace didn't come from constant struggle, but from accepting the natural flow of life. It was like George's river. He didn't need to control the water for it to flow. He just needed to allow it to follow its course. As time passed, Edward felt more and more at peace with his journey. He learned that the search for balance wasn't a race to reach a final destination, but rather a daily practice, a constant path of evolution. And despite the challenges and uncertainties that arose, he now knew that peace was within him, accessible at any moment, when he allowed himself to enter silence and accept life as it was. At the end of his path of self-discovery, Edward finally understood that purification wasn't just about cleaning the body, mind, or soul once and for all. It was about the ongoing process of observing, accepting, and flowing with what was. True freedom lay in accepting the present moment, in the silence that comes when the mind doesn't resist, but surrenders to the now.